Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of the Study Institute for IAS. Myself Aman Jha. We are continuing with the NCERT concept series. In the previous lectures, we have finished the history NCERT of class 6. From this lecture, we are going to start with the history of class 7. The name of the previous book was Our Past 1 and this is the Our Past 2. Okay. So today is the first lecture of class 7 history NCERT. So let's start. See, this is the contents of the book. Okay, there are total 10 chapters. In today's we are going to cover the chapter 1. See, to briefly summarize, this is again about the getting this sense of what we are going to study. Okay, if you remember, the first chapter of the last NCERT was focused on sources, that what are the sources of studying NCERT. Similarly, this chapter also talks about sources. It talks about how the sources for studying the medieval NCERT have changed from the sources for ancient. Also, it tells us a broad overview of what we are going to study. Then this one focuses on the early medieval period, okay, a period which roughly belongs to this part, okay, and then about Delhi Sultanate, Mughal Empire, rulers, and then about the art and culture and various facets of social life. See, through these chapters, do not get an impression that they will only talk about the political history, that who ruled for how long, from where, such stuff. No, the political dynasty or political history and dates are just a backdrop, okay, a background to study the larger social changes. So let's start today with the chapter 1. Tracing changes through 1,000 years. Okay, which 1,000 years? From 700 CE to 750 CE. Why these two landmarks? Because this is considered as the end of Harshvardhan's empire. Okay, and at this point, if you recall, in 1757 there was Battle of Plassey, and with this the colonial period of Indian history began. So therefore, this 1,000-year period is roughly taken as a two benchmarks, or rather two dividing lines. See here, it says tracing changes through 1,000 years. That means changes kept happening through these 1,000 years. Okay, so obviously to study those changes, you will need sources. But before that, it tries to highlight some key issues apart from many other in studying different sorts of sources. And it gives two examples of cartography and changes in the meaning of terms. It says, look how even cartography, now obviously maps are very important source of studying history, okay, but by giving the example of changes in the sciences of cartography and by giving example of how meaning of terms change from one century to other and to the next, they try to highlight that when we are studying history, especially from sources, we should be careful to understand the context in which a particular source was written or created. Okay, I'll give you one example. Suppose in an archaeological excavation, you come across a terracotta figurine. A terracotta figurine of Mother Goddess. So you have a small terracotta figurine, you will say, okay, this is a figurine of a female, but is it just a toy or a deity? That will depend where you have found that artifact. If you have found in a surrounding which appears like a sacred place, which appears like a temple, which appears like a some sort of ritual area, then you can say that this figurine, this small figurine, was a deity. But if you have found it among toys of children or within a household where there is not much set up for religious activity, then you will say no, it's not a deity, it's just a toy. Similarly, when we are studying literary sources, you have to understand when that particular literary source was created, by whom, what was the motive, etc. And then they talk about mainly three to four sorts of histories. They talked about new social and political groups. Where did they come from? How did they emerge? How did they acquire political and economic power? They talk about regions and empires, especially because up to the beginning of medieval period, regional identities were already created. Regional identity or regionalism was already created, and the empire building activity or imperialism was constantly clashing with it. Both were shaping each other. This is one of the feature of medieval period. Either we look at the Chola Empire, or we look at the Delhi Sultanate, we look at the Mughal Empire. The constant struggle between regional identity and regionalism and the central political imperial power, and how both the processes had profound social and economic impacts. So it talks about that, and then talks about old and new religions. Obviously, such a long period, so there will be many natural, social and economic developments, which in turn will influence the religious developments. Okay. And then at last it talks about the periodization of history, because to study history, even though it's a rather mundane exercise, still you have to categorize it. You have to categorize history in ancient, medieval, modern, early medieval, so that you can take up a particular section of history and study it, and especially focus on continuities and changes during that period. So first we start with the example of cartography. It says it has compared two maps. A map produced in 12th century. Look, when I say 12th century, it means from 1100 to 1199 CE. Okay. And this is 18th century, which will be from 700 to 799. This will be the 18th century. See, it has compared two maps, one produced in 12th century by an Arab geographer and another produced by a Frenchman who had mercantile interest. Okay, you don't have to remember the name. What was the name of the cartographer? Here they have approached. See, this one is rather more familiar. Okay, here you have north, south, east, west. This map appears more familiar, but this is rather strange. Here Sri Lanka is at the top and Indian subcontinent is at the bottom. Southeast Asia is like just one large blob, and for some reason they have shortened the distance between Antarctica and India. So what it tells you, the level of technological development. Okay, but then here the map is, especially look at the border areas. See how well detailed it is. They have pointed out so many cities and ports, etc. Why? Because it was a European map produced in 18th century, especially by a community or a society that was very interested in trade, coastal trade. So they had a very good knowledge of coastal area. But look at the inland. Now we saw how strange this one appears, this map. It's almost, upside down. But this one, coastal area is very finely drawn, but look at here, the path of Ganga, how it they have no idea how it came here. Similarly, look at Gulf of Cambay, Gulf of Khambat, Gulf of Kutch, this is Gulf of Khambat. So it tells you even their understanding of interior was not that great. The point is, when we were comparing these two maps, we should understand the context in which they were made. When the maps were made, one in 12th century, another is 18th. Obviously, the knowledge of geography will be very different and very advanced up to the 18th century. What was the interest of cartographers? One was a simple geographer, a thinker, an intellectual. Another was a member of mercantile class. So, knowledge generation is a hobby for one person, but another is an outright commercial interest. Also, the Arabs, Central Asians, etc., viewed India from the direction of North India. So, for them, North India came first. But for a European trading company, they viewed Indian subcontinent from the direction of coastline. So, for them, coastline was more important. And level of scientific development. See, the art and science of cartography requires some sophistication. What we saw here, that they had no sense of, in fact, it's a part of a larger world map. Okay, the map is not exclusively focused on India, it's part of a larger world map. What they drew from the direction they saw. But however, up to 18th century, a convention had appeared of making maps in this direction, that north will face up, south will face down, east and west. Why? Because of the use of magnets. Since they started using magnets for marine navigation, they came up with the convention that north will be upside, then south, east and west. Similarly, the understanding of coastline improved because of detailed surveys. So, whenever you are studying a source, map or something else, always be aware of the context in which it was written. This is just one example in explaining how historical sources should be studied. And not only maps, text also. See, text etc. have context, even words. Why? Take the example of word Hindustan. Minhajus Siraj, who wrote in early 13th century, when he talks about Hindustan, he mainly means North India. And even in North India, he only refers to Punjab, Haryana, Western UP and etc. This the part which was part of the Delhi Sultanate at that point. But by the time Babur wrote his biography, Baburnama, when he refers to the larger Indian society, its climate, its vegetation, its animals, when Babur describes India as Hindustan, he is talking about the entire subcontinent. Similarly, Amir Khusro has a very similar idea in the mind. So the word Hindustan, now you must remember, it comes from Hind. Okay, Hind comes from Indus. So basically, Central Asians and West Asians who could not say Indus, they said Hindus, and people living around that river or across that river were called Hindu. So the word Hindustan means the land of Hindus, comes from that context, and then the meaning of that word changed from 13th century writer Minhajus Siraj to Baburnama in 15th century, and then up to Amir Khusro. So even the words, their meaning change, quality of maps change entirely. So therefore, the idea of context is very important. For example, this author Minhajus Siraj, basically Minhajus Siraj, Ziauddin Barni and Shams Siraj Afif, these three persons or these three historians have written very detailed account of the political history of Delhi Sultanate. Okay, whenever you start studying the political history of Delhi Sultanate, these three become very important. Without using the historical work by these three historians, the modern historians could not have constructed the political history of Delhi Sultanate. But what used to happen, that they were court scholars, meaning they were not only closely associated with sultans, they were patronized by sultans as well. So obviously, whatever they write or whenever they write about the political history of Sultanate, they will write about it in glowing terms. They will exaggerate the victories, they will exaggerate the personal quality of Sultan, they will exaggerate the efficiency of administration. They will rather, especially when they write about the society and culture, they would put down the majority, and then what they will do, that they will try to highlight that the polarization between ruling class and commoners was more. than what it actually was. So whenever you are reading a source, context matters. Who is writing, when he was writing, for whom he was writing, he or she maybe. So context matters. Okay. We saw it in the example of maps. We saw it in the meaning of words. The idea of India certainly existed, but the word Hindustan did not carry the same meaning. It carried different meaning in 13th century, or perhaps earlier, before the advent of Islam. It may have carried even a smaller meaning. Maybe only area around Indus was called Hindustan. Okay. For a very long time, Hindustan referred to North India and Deccan referred to South India. Similarly, the word foreigner. What today when we say a foreigner, we mean that a person who is not a citizen of India carries the passport of another sovereign nation. But in the past, if someone went to a village or a city which he did not belong to, that person would be called a foreigner, a Pardesi, Ajnabi. Okay, someone from Udaygiri went to Delhi or Bengal, he would be called Ajnabi. But now today, though that person would still be Ajnabi, unknown. Okay. But he would not be called Pardesi, because Pardesi means someone who comes from another desh. Now the definition of desh has changed from what it meant in medieval times to modern times. So the meaning of words changes, the quality of information changes. And then they come about another issue, the sources for studying history, the continuities and changes. They say that the things like coins, inscriptions, architecture and textual sources, they continue to be important sources to study the history of the period. For example, any king who conquered a place, what they would do, it was a tradition to immediately mint a coin. That coin will carry the legend of the king, the date of the victory, and the different titles that king used for himself. Inscriptions, often kings and sultans and badshahs issued inscriptions. Architecture, the architecture of regional architecture, temple architecture, mosque architecture, the Indo-Islamic architecture, the architecture of Mughals, the architecture of Delhi Sultanate. So these things continue to be a source for studying history. But there are discontinuities as well. For example, the number and variety of textual records increased dramatically during this period. Okay, the number as well as variety, meaning the subject matter on which they were written. Okay, and textual sources mean literary sources. Okay, increased dramatically during this period. Why? The reason is here, because paper became very cheap. I mean, in the ancient period, during the ancient period, there was this Chinese scholar who came to India, and he wanted to reproduce the manuscripts that were locally available. But eventually, he ran out of paper. He searched for it, he could not find it, so eventually he sent letter to his friends in China and said, "Please send me paper." So such was the scarcity of paper. So obviously, whatever you write, if you write on birch leaf, palm leaf, they don't survive, they decompose. In any case, writing was not very popular because of lack of paper. So paper not only decomposed, it was also not available widely. But things change in the medieval period. How? And they are giving one example, that in the middle of 13th century, meaning from this will be 13th century. Okay, a scholar wanted to copy a book. Copy a book means you have to reproduce what is written. So technically both will be called manuscript. The fresh one that you have written, that will also be called manuscript, and the one you are copying from, that will also be called manuscript, because eventually in both cases you are writing from hand. So okay, writing by hand. In fact, the printing press in India was introduced by Portuguese, and it became popular even much later. So even now, though you have paper, the paper is widely available, still you are copying things. Okay, just the way you have copied homework in your school from a notebook of a friend. But he did not have enough paper, so he washed a manuscript he did not want, dried the paper and used it. But a century later, if you bought some food in the market, you could have the shopkeeper wrap it up for you in some paper. So see, paper must be very costly at this point in the middle of 13th century. But by the middle of 14th century, it became so cheap that they started using it as a pudiya. You know, whenever you buy something, they wrap it up in the pudiya and give it to you. So now people could write. Okay. Earlier, the people could write earlier as well, on palm leaf and birch, etc. But they are not easy to produce. Paper is easier to produce. So the writing or the practice of writing or the habit of writing increased much more. Now imagine in modern times you cannot think about a society without paper, especially during the school and college education. But what if it was very costly and the alternative to it was very difficult to produce? Okay, you have to cut leaves and process it, etc. So the practice of writing would be obviously rather less popular. But now the paper was available. Not only available, it became so cheap. So obviously the number and variety of textual records increased dramatically during this period. Therefore, this was the discontinuity, that compared to earlier period, the dependence of historians on literary sources increased exponentially, because now almost everything could be studied from paper. Earlier you depended on coin to decide that which king came after the other. What was the year of his coronation? Okay, how he was known. So earlier you depended on things like inscription to decide that which area of the country he or she conquered. Okay, you depended on copper plate inscriptions to decide what was the nature of land grants. You depended on them, especially for the for example, for the Gupta period, you depend on the copper plate inscriptions to understand the administration of Gupta Empire. But now the historian or the court historian will write about the administration. So if you have a copy of that, then you don't have to depend on inscriptions. There is a very popular copper plate inscription or a set of copper plate inscriptions called Damodarpur copper plate inscriptions. Okay, and they are used to study the administration of Gupta Empire. But up to this time, you have so much literary source that some historian or some court scholar or some administrator would have written about the administration, so you use that one. People used it to write holy texts, chronicle of rulers, letters and teachings of saints, petitions and judicial records, and for the maintenance of accounts and taxation. See, is there any period in ancient history from which taxation records have survived? Is there any period from the ancient history where judicial records have survived? See, taxation records, judicial records, petitions, chronicles of rulers. Earlier, what used to happen? That we will study a prashasti or depend on some Puran that was written down much later. So earlier you depended on a prashasti. For example, Allahabad Prashasti, Prayag Prashasti, or the Prashasti of Gautami Putra Satkarni, or Rudradaman's Prashasti, or Prashasti of Pulakeshin II, to understand the chronicle of kings. Okay. But now their court scholars will give you a detailed account. Taxation records. So the availability, the number and variety of literary sources has gone up significantly. Earlier, what used to happen? That teaching of saints. Now the teaching of Buddha were orally transmitted by their disciples for very long period and written down much later. But now we will see a category of text called Malfuzat, and they are basically the teachings of Sufi saints that were written down by their disciples whenever that teaching was given. So for every area of study, new sources have come up. Okay, and now onwards, the literary sources will literally dominate the history study. Any other source, archaeological, coins, architecture, they will be supplementary. For example, when we study Delhi Sultanate, you must have heard the name of some important rulers like Iltutmish, Balban, Alauddin Khalji, okay, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Earlier, we used to depend on their architecture, okay, for earlier kings to understand the level of political and economic prosperity. But we do know now how the frontiers of their empires expanded or contracted, and then we see the impact of that prosperity or poverty on the quality of their architecture. So what has happened, that literary source has acquired far more significance compared to archaeological or other sorts of sources. As I said, you are not dependent exclusively on the coins to decide the chronology of rulers. You have textual sources, some or the other. Using the three sources I just mentioned, Barni, Afif and Siraj, you can construct the entire chronology of Delhi Sultanate rulers. You are dependent only on the to study the times of Akbar, the most important source is a work of his court historian Abul Fazl, and his work called Aine Akbari. That is the only, or not the only, but the most important source to study the period. Okay, in Aine Akbari is written in three parts, and using that you study everything about Akbar's time, his administration, his political conquest, his religious policy, his policy towards Rajputs, his policy towards Deccan. So the nature of study changes now, and the literary sources dominate the historical discussions. Manuscripts were collected by wealthy people, nobles, rulers, monasteries, mosques, khanka. Khanka means it's a hospice of Sufi saints. Okay, they were placed in libraries and archives. These manuscripts come documents, provided a lot of detailed information to historians. See, a document is called manuscript when it is handwritten. Okay, that's all. It need not be original. It can be a copy of another manuscript as long as it is handwritten. If it is printed, then it would not be called a manuscript. Then you can simply call it a document. Also, this new class of people. See, did we ever, though during the time of Gupta, we get some information about his, the feudalization of administration. We said that Hari Sen inherited the office of Mahadandanayak from his father, and he was holding two offices together, being a Mahadandanayak and being Sandhi Vigrahak. Also, we talked about Samant, Mahasamant. But beyond such superficial discussions, or during the period of Ashok, we come across these powerful ministers called Dhamma Mahamattas. So beyond such superficial discussions, we never really go into the nature of the bureaucracy. That what sort of people were acquiring different key positions in administration. Okay, what sort of policies that the theocracy or the priestly class followed. Okay, what was their approach towards larger society, towards kingship. So from medieval period, this new class comes up. The nobles. What were the nobles? They were the rich and powerful members of a ruling class. They would not only hold important administrative positions at central as well as provincial level, they will often have their large armies that they will maintain on their own expenses, that will serve them as well as emperor as well, and the support of nobility, the noble class, ulema or umra, amir and umra, the words are used. The support of Amir class or Umrah class was very crucial for the survival of Sultan or Badshah or king per se. So this is another important group that it suddenly comes into discussion, that what was the approach or attitude of noble class towards a particular king or a particular policy of the king, how they negotiated for power with king. So this also happens because we have this new category of source called literary sources. Often these nobles wrote down about themselves or patronized scholars that wrote down about themselves. Now, here we said that they were placed in libraries and archives. These manuscripts cum documents provide a lot of detailed information to the historians. But now, what is this but? Will come here soon. Okay, let me write down this but here so that we recall what we were discussing. See, the following, I have framed up prelims questions here that could be asked. That following terms pertain to which of the areas given below? Okay, Nastalik and Shikaste. No, it's common question in prelims that they will give you a few terms. This in 2020's prelims there were these terms called Kollivappa, Dronavappa. What are they? Are they units of taxation? Are they coins? Are they units of land measurement? So similarly, these two terms are given. Basically, these two are scripts. Scripts for writing Persian as well as Arabic. This one is slightly thicker writing, so it's rather difficult to read, and this one is easier to read. So the answer is it pertains to script. These are two scripts to write Persian as Arabic. Now here we had said that they give a lot of information to the historians, but, and here I said that out of two scripts for writing Persian and Arabic, Shikaste is thicker and Nastalik is easier. Now, if you must remember that when you suppose during school or college you bunk a class for a day for genuine or superficial reason, whatever you do, and now you take the notebook of your friend because you want to copy the class what the teacher taught in class or what the homework was. When you are copying from that friend's notebook, you must realize often you don't handwriting is not legible. Okay, so you interpret what that person has written. Also, sometimes you find that okay, something that is written there, but it is obviously inaccurate, so you change it. Sometimes you change it because though it might be accurate, but it doesn't suit your taste or your moral values. So your version of that class note and the original class note differ from each other slightly. Then another generation, okay, some more changes. Another generation, some more changes. So these manuscripts that were copied, okay, by person, by writing each and everything. So if between two notebooks there can be a considerable variety, imagine what happens when the manuscripts are copied and reproduced for centuries. There will be significant differences between them. Okay, say in the beginning we saw two types of maps. One was produced in 12th century and one was produced in 18th century. Now imagine someone was writing something on the political history of India, okay, or writing about the beauty of coastal areas of India, okay. When the original scholar had started writing, he would have used a map produced in this. But by the time of 18th century, he would know that no, that map was highly inaccurate and I must use the new map produced in 18th century. Okay. Similarly, the meaning of word Hindustan. Suppose someone wrote something in 13th century and used Hindustan only for certain provinces of North India, not even entire North India. But someone who writes in 17th century during the peak of Mughal era, when they say Hindustan, it means the entire North India, Bengal, Gujarat, Malwa, okay, maybe not Deccan because even then Deccan was called Deccan differently, Dakkan, etc. So since things are reproduced by writing each and everything, handwritten things, manuscripts, also since the technology changes, since the meaning of word change, though literary evidence give us lot of information, we must always be aware and alert to the context in which they were written. Okay, if a court scholar writes about for example there was this individual Abdul Qadir Badayuni. He was very critical of Akbar's religious policy, okay, but he did not criticize it while Akbar was alive. He wrote a secret volume and published it much later. Rather, his children published it, and he is very critical of Akbar. Now, if imagine you don't look at the work of Abul Fazl and you only refer to his work, how misconceived, or rather inappropriate, or rather inaccurate description would that be? So though literary sources are now widely available because the paper is cheap, and they do give us a very different kind of information, so much so that they have made archaeological sources rather secondary, but we must be aware of the context in which they were written. Often you will see that a particular king or sultan will claim that these many areas were under my submitted to me, but the truth is they may only be paying a certain tribute, so they are not part of your empire. They have very much their own independent existence. They are autonomous, but they write it in their source that this if a sultan sitting in Delhi will say that even Kerala is rather Coromandel coast is paying tribute to me, Bengal is paying tribute to me, Sindh is paying tribute to me. There is this very famous medieval saying that Sultanate Shah Alam just Dilli te palam, means though you call yourself Shah Alam, the king, the king of the world, but your sultanate is only from Delhi to Palam, which is nearby Palam airport. So literary sources cannot be taken at face value. We must remain critical while studying them. That is the message here. Now they are talking about few important strands of history. First we talked about sources and their limitations and their achievements, but now we talk about some key strands of history. Remember, we had talked about 5 dimensions of history: political, economic, social, cultural, religious, and they all impact each other. They all change at the same time. See, they have talked about few technological changes, things like Persian wheel, it is used in irrigation. The 2 key features of Persian wheels are the gear system as well as the use of animal force. Without these two, an irrigation apparatus cannot be called a Persian wheel. It has to be based on gear system and it has to use animal force. Spinning wheel, obviously for cotton manufacturing, textile manufacturing. Firearms for war. Some times ago there was this question in prelims in 2015 maybe. They had given 3 statements about Babur and they said which of the following are correct. One of the statements was that Babur introduced gunpowder in India, and it's a very popular myth with Babur. So many of the students said it correct, but it's very clearly written in the Satish Chandra NCERT that though Babur used gunpowder very efficiently in first battle of Panipat, but the gunpowder as a technology for war was in usage from a slightly earlier period. Okay, and then new sorts of mortar, to bind the stones and bricks, and then potatoes, corn, chili, tea, coffee. All these technologies or goods or new ideas were brought by new people. See, earlier we didn't have transfer of technology, that India will sign a bilateral agreement with a foreign country to transfer a certain technology so that Indian companies can produce fine quality goods in India. Earlier, new ideas, goods and technology moved with people. The Persian wheel was brought by Turks, okay, and these crops were brought by Portuguese from New World, from South America, North America. So earlier new things came with movement of people, or someone went somewhere, learned something. In the last few lectures we had talked about Silk Route, and that how those silk production was perfected in China thousands of years ago. They kept it a secret for a very long time, but certain people from Western world went there and rather maybe they stole the technology from that part of the world. So technology, for the movement of technology, people must move from one part of the world to another. And this movement, I read this quote somewhere that the history of the world is the history of migration, and that that history must be retold time and again. So these things came with new people and they became part of India. And this is not only a medieval phenomena. In postmodern period, we talked about Kushanas and certain other Central Asian groups. Now it is widely believed that the concept of tunic, the concept of those arching shoes, the concept of turban, the concept of stitched clothes, such things were brought to India by these groups. So this is not a medieval phenomena only, it has been a continuous process. This was also a period of great mobility. Groups of people traveled long distances in search of opportunity. Now we do know people like Muhammad Ghori and Mahmud Ghazni, etc. But there were many groups that traveled from one place to another. There was this group in coastal Andhra called Eastern Chalukyas. They had migrated from Karnataka area, from the original branch of Chalukyas. Then there were Eastern Gangas in Odisha area. They had migrated from the Ganga, the area of Ganga dynasty in southern Karnataka, Tamil Nadu border. Entire lineages migrated from one place to another and put down its political power there. So from the Chalukyas of Karnataka, Eastern Chalukya lineage branched out and they established their power in the coastal areas of Andhra Pradesh. Similarly, from the ruling dynasty, Ganga dynasty of southern Karnataka and Tamil Nadu border area, where you have Mysore, okay, you have Sarvanbelgola, so these areas belong to the Ganga dynasty. They migrated to Odisha and a lineage branched off and put down its roots in Odisha. Similarly, the Rashtrakutas, though it is widely understood that they were originally from the Kannada speaking area, they went from there to Ilichpur, which is in modern MP near the Tapi river. Okay, there they put down their roots and for a very long time they were subsidiaries of Chalukyas and eventually they overthrew Chalukyas and established their own kingdom. So the movement of lineages and people from one part of the country to another was very common. Sometimes they went for political opportunity, sometimes they went for traveling purposes, etc. Sometimes they went for purely economic activity. For example, a historian called Richard Egan talks about a group called Purbiya Rajput. Basically, they were hired as soldiers from the eastern India, eastern UP, Bihar, etc. by the rulers or the Rajput rulers or nobles of this Indore, Bhopal, and southern Rajasthan area. But since their masters were Rajput, so these people who migrated from eastern India were also called Rajputs. They became Purbiya Rajput. So this movement was very common. Now, partly as a part of this process and partly in itself, many new social groups emerged in this period. For example, the Kayasthas. Now, the Kayasths were originally scribes, but eventually it emerged as a caste. Ahoms, they migrated from Southeast Asia or Burma area into the Assam Valley, Brahmaputra Valley. And there they put down their kingdom and they gave a very stiff resistance to the Mughal Empire when it tried to expand into Brahmaputra Valley. The Sikhs and Jats, they transformed from pastoralist to agriculturalist. And though they may have migrated from modern Sindh and upper Indus Valley towards the currently Punjab Haryana area, from pastoralist to agriculturalist. The Marathas or the Kunbi peasantry, first they rose in the administration of Bahmani kingdom and the successor states, and then they eventually put down their own Maratha empire. Similarly, Rajputs, though the history of the emergence of Rajputs is rather complex, and we will see it in later chapters, but for currently we can understand that first they emerged as a political class. Rajput means they claim the Kshatriya Varna and they say that the literal meaning is the son of a ruler. However, gradually certain social and economic processes propelled some other groups into the Rajput class, and then eventually it became a tightly knit class of now at that point, by the time they became a caste, not only rulers or nobles but even soldiers and large landholders were also calling themselves Rajputs, and this tightly knit close caste group was based on certain moral and values of valor, chivalry, etc. So even this was It's a very complex process, but partly it can be explained by, people traveling. Now, throughout this period, there was a gradual clearing of forests and extension of agriculture with varying speed and impact in different areas. Many forest dwellers migrated, others became peasant, migrated to, deeper into forests. Others became peasants. These new peasant groups gradually began to be influenced by regional markets, chieftains, priests, Sufis and temples, and became part of large complex societies. They were required to pay taxes and offer services to local lords. Significant socio-economic differences emerged among peasants. Why this? Because obviously not everybody will have same quality of land. Someone will have very fertile land, so gradually his family will become rich. Someone would have, less land or less fertile land, so they will acquire the middle part. Then someone will, supplement his income from agriculture with other trading, small artisanal activity. They will also be in the middle part. But then there will be poor ones that will only be laboring on the land of other people. So the idea is the peasantization of a tribal society. Now, tribal society, since they do not have inequality of wealth, they tend to be socially egalitarian. Okay. Since economic inequality is relatively less, social inequality is also not there, and they are socially equal, or the word is egalitarian. But in a peasant society, due to differential access to resources such as land, political power, etc., differentiation takes place. So economic inequality leads to social inequality and political inequality. So you will have large zamindars, you will have intermediary landlords, you will have marginal farmers, and then you will have simple laborers. So first, economic inequality leads to social inequality, and that leads to political inequality, that a local society will be dominated by large zamindars, etc. So a peasant society, since it is economically unequal, it is socially unequal and then politically unequal as well. So this is what it says here, that significant socio-economic differences emerged among peasants. A more differentiated society was organized into a hierarchy of jatis on the basis of influence and resources controlled by jatis. Jati means caste. The status of same jati had spatial and temporal variation. For example, if a particular jati had limited access to resources in a particular area, then its social influence and political influence will be less. But in other area, if it had access to a lot of land, okay, economically prosperous, then it will be politically powerful as well. So even a single jati can have different position in the social hierarchy at different points. See, actually, what this phenomena hints at, apart from other things, is a concept of land grants. Now, it is a pursuit of almost every king and sultan to expand the agriculture, because the correlation between economic activity and the strength of state that we have already seen. And land grant was a very important instrument to expand agriculture. Okay. Earlier, the land grants were made to individual Brahmins and Buddhist monks only. The purpose was, okay, a certain land is being given to you, you go expand agriculture there, okay, with your knowledge of agriculture, and then pay a certain amount of taxes and keep the rest. Now, how do you deal with local people? And if there are no local people, how do you bring labor from outside area? That is your concern. But gradually, even administrative rights were transferred to them. Now, you could not only keep the surplus you generated in that land, you had administrative autonomy over that land. Okay. This happened up to the Gupta period. Land grant continued at least from postmodern period. Okay. Now, earlier only economic rights, now administrative rights as well to individuals, but now even groups, temples, especially with the beginning of, though we should not start talk about temples right now, they are rather a little insignificant at this point. But now you must have heard that in Gupta period, hereditary offices, people holding multiple offices, okay. Now there is a theory that from this period onwards there was a decline in money economy. Therefore, even officials were paid in terms of land grants. This is true from the period of Harshvardhan. So officials were given salaries in the form of land grants. Then even temples, monasteries, though mosque and khanka will come from medieval period, Buddhist monasteries, they were made land grants to maintain their own, as the temple cult became popular, that larger and larger temples were constructed, you need land for their maintenance. So even they were granted land, and the trustees of that temple could sublease that land to landowners. And then came the idea of military grants up to the medieval period. What are the military grants? Here we had seen how we said that this was also a period of great mobility. Groups of people traveled long distances in search of opportunity, and we gave example of Eastern Chalukyas, Eastern Gangas and Rashtrakutas. These are the prominent ones. There were many such lineages that moved from one part of the country to another, establish its foothold in the area and to acquire political power. Now suppose there is a large lineage that moves. One of the member of the lineage will become king. What about the other important families of the lineage, other important members? They will be given military grants so that they have full autonomy within the area given to them. However, they have to serve the king whenever he calls them up to give military services, whenever he calls them up to appear in his court, whenever he calls them up to marry his daughter to his sons or himself. So your king will give you military grant, you maintain your armies and your own expenditure from that grant, and you render certain services in return. So this is the concept of military grants. Even in the rise of Rajput class, there was a very important role of military grants. So up to this point you have military grants. This phenomena is, this started happening from especially in the early medieval period. Now in all these, the emphasis is on expansion of agriculture. Expansion of agriculture. Say in a military grant, your king gave you land so that you can render him military services. But don't you think that you need a lot of income from that land? So they will focus on expansion of agriculture. Temples and monasteries, they will focus on expansion of agriculture. Official salary, since a particular land is your salary, so whatever you can grow out of that land is yours. So you will again focus on expansion. Through all this, there is consensus among historians about land grants. But after this point, the consensus breaks down. Some historians, especially the older ones, say that this had a very harmful impact on the political structure. However, some say no, it did not it didn't have a harmful impact, it had a positive impact. The first group, especially the Marxist one, they talk about the disintegration of political structure, and which eventually led to the early medieval period. One talks about the disintegration of state. He said that existing empires broke down, but the another says no, the existing empires did not break down, the new ones emerged. Though I understand that at this point I am giving very little information, but since we are studying a 7th class history, this is the extent to which we can go at this point. And not only, even in higher classes, they do not focus on the subject anymore. The reason for picking this up was that throughout this period there was gradual clearing of forest and extension of agriculture. This was being taken primarily through the institution of land grant, and that is why I chose to mention it as much as I can. But to understand this topic more, to understand the phenomena of land grant more and how it changed the Indian society from ancient into medieval, you have to take it as serious, systematically, in a seriously. Either you are studying GS or optional, there you look into it. Land grant, I mean, many historians believe that it was not simply an economic or political phenomena. It had many social, cultural, even religious impacts. You might find it strange that historians see the evidence of the feudalization of society through land grants even in the temple architecture. Okay, in the panchayatan, often what they do, that they have this principal shrine here, and then you have subsidiary shrines here. It's called panchayatan style. So they say that this has to be a shrine dedicated to the king, and these has to be the shrines dedicated to his nobles. Sometimes the king is here, and then nobles are in 4 directions. So they find the evidence of feudalization via land grants in architecture as well. So it talks about one continuous process of expansion of agriculture, conversion of first will be expansion of agriculture. Another will be peasantization and all the accompanying socio-economic differentiation of tribal society. Now suppose you are producing, who is leading the peasantization? The person who has been given land grant. Now that land grant could be given to a priest, it could be given to a monk, it could be given to a person with entrepreneurial spirit. Okay, it could be given to a military general or an officer who is given it as a salary. Okay, it could be, and from later times it could be even given to Sufi saints. Okay, where they could preach their religion and help people to live a settled lifestyle. And then other groups that they have mentioned here, apart from Sufis, we have given temples, we mentioned already, chieftains. So such groups were given grants, and what we say, that since people became part of large complex society, they were required to pay taxes and offer services to local lords. So whosoever was given land grant will encourage the tribals and the people living in frontier areas to settle down, practice agriculture, pay taxes. And since such places did not have enough firm imperial control, they would even have rather exploitative structures in place. It says that people became part of large complex societies. How? Now you saw that often grants were made to temples. Okay, grants were made to Sufi saints, etc. We also saw that how in peasant society social inequality leads to economic inequality. Economic inequality leads to social inequality and political inequality. Now, how social inequality manifests in the case of India? Social inequality manifests in the form of the Varna hierarchy, Jati hierarchy. So a rich zamindar will automatically will acquire a higher position in caste hierarchy, whereas a landless labor or a person doing menial job will acquire a low status. Also, you are producing surplus. That surplus has to be traded. It will be traded in local markets. There is this medieval term where we use the word kasbah. Okay, so such kasbahs and nattar, nagaram, etc. emerged in this period. So this is how a society which was still untouched by mainstream becomes part of it and becomes part of the larger structure. You also have a jati vyavastha, caste system. Other parts of country will also have caste system. You also produce tradable goods, they also produce tradable goods. So you also consume same kind of items. So this is how they become part of the larger, what we said here, part of the complex societies. And often the powerful castes had their own jati panchayat where they manage their own affairs and tend to impose their dictates on the less vulnerable, more vulnerable people as well. Now, regions and empire. See, there have been few important empires in medieval period: the Chol Empire, Tughlaqs, and Mughals. And they have given this example of a Sanskrit inscription of the reign of Ghiyasuddin Balban. Actually, there is this place called Palam, and there is a Bawli, means a step well. It's called Palam Bawli inscription. It is written for a Ghiyasuddin Balban, an important sultan of the slave dynasty in 13th century, and written in Sanskrit. It is written for him, not by him. Now, what it says, it praises Balban just as Prayag Prashasti praises Samudragupta, lavishly, okay, spectacularly, great praise. And it says how Balban's army marched through so many regions, conquered so many regions. They have given name of the regions: Sindh, Bengal, Malwa, Gujarat, etc. They have given so many regions. So first point is why you have to mention that so many regions have surrendered to you. Okay. Similarly, there is an inscription of this Nagbhat of Gurjar Pratihar dynasty. He also says that many regions have submitted to his authority. So first question is why such inscriptions praise rather uncritically, because there is no way you would acquire such far off regions under your direct control. At best, you would have defeated them, extracted tribute, occasional services, but not full annexation. So why do they do that? The obvious answer is the tendency to build empire. Ambitious people had tendency to build empire, but such inscriptions also tell us that regional identities had emerged as early as 700 CE. So when a inscription mentions different areas with different names, so obviously it has acquired a regional identity. Geographical identity eventually allows for emergence of distinct cultural identity. Okay, it's, I think, self-explanatory. Regional cultural identity props up political ambitions. Suppose a particular geographical area that also has a unique, a Coromandel coast or Tamil region has a unique Tamil culture. Okay, say a Bengal region has a unique Bengali culture in terms of its language, in terms of architecture, in terms of dressing sense, in terms of preferences, in terms of religious and moral values. So suppose a geographical area called Bengal also has a culture called Bengali culture, then it would inevitably lead to the rise of political ambitions of a Bengal Sultanate. Okay, so regional cultural identity props up political ambitions. You must see the glimpse of such frictions in the federal structure of modern India. Though not similar, because here states try to become sovereign, but here they are only asserting their regional autonomy. So early medieval period has this unique feature of regional dynasties. Why? Because now geographical identity had turned into cultural identity, and it was now fueling political ambitions, that local states based on local identity, local cultural identity, was trying to establish a local a local dynasty based on local geography. So regional dynasties were a feature of it, but at the same time there were empires as well. We gave the example of Cholas, Tughlaqs, Mughals. Now Chola Empire lasted much longer, Tughlaq Empire lasted for a very short period, but Mughal Empire also lasted a very long period. But what happened that the moment an empire collapses, the regional states again raised their head. This happened in the case of Tughlaqs. This happened in the case of Mughals. So this, this friction between a regional state and an imperial state is a hallmark of medieval period. The moment imperial power becomes powerful, it expands, but the moment it becomes weak, the regional powers, acquire independence. And at the base of this regional assertion is a unique cultural identity. Okay, whenever, for example, in the case of Bahmani kingdom, when it ruptured and split into 5 parts, the regional kingdoms try to, model themselves along the regional cultures. They will promote local language, they will promote local people into administration, they will adopt local manner of governance. Okay, for example, the Ahmednagar and Bijapur, both Sultanate, gave very important positions to Maratha Sardars. And this experience with administration helped them to fight Mughal Empire later. So political separation reinforces as well as feeds on cultural distinctiveness. Pan-regional forces of integration with regional distinctiveness. There was this conflict. Okay. On one hand, there were pan-regional forces of integration, especially the desire to create empires. And what happens that, look, it is not a binary that now a regional state prevails or now an imperial state prevails. Now a regional culture prevails, now imperial culture prevails. There is always this communication, this dialogue, this intercourse. And for example, through the Mughal Empire, the elements of Mughal culture spread throughout the India. Those elements interacted with local culture and created new elements. You will see that due to the vast expanse of Mughal Empire, the elements of Gujarat architecture were incorporated into the Mughal architecture made in Agra. Okay, so, but eventually, when the empire splits, again the separation happens. So, this is a continuous dialogue between local culture and imperial culture, and it changes both of them at the same time. Then you have old and new religions. See, religious developments are closely linked to society level development. Now we talked about peasantization of tribal society. A part of the peasantization was that the local tribal deities were now worshipped in temples. As the temple cult spread, the local tribal deity was, incorporated as an avatar of a deity of the large, part of the larger Hindu pantheon. So, such things, social developments impact religious developments as well. Relationship between worship of new deities, temple construction, patronage to Brahmanas, land grants, and search for legitimacy for kings. So, for example, a new king come to power. He needs legitimacy. He needs someone to, consecrate him, someone to write stories in his praise. For example, the Gurjar Pratihar, which was a very important early medieval dynasty of Western and Northern India. They had an origin myth in which they said that they originated from Lakshman of Ramayana fame, because since he was the gatekeeper of his brother, they are also called Pratihar, means they are also his descendants, so therefore they have this name Pratihar. So they had this origin myth. Now in constructing such origin myths, okay, they needed active association of priestly class, Brahmanas. Okay, and how would they be pleased? To get their association, they will be made land grants. Also, kings would construct temples. You have Brihadeshwara temple of Tanjore. You have, the Chalukyan temple architecture of Aihole, Badami, Pattadakal. You have temples of, Hoysala. Now, up to the early medieval period, basically, you had 3 full-fledged temple architectural schools. You have Nagara school of North India with various, sub-branches, Gujarat, Odisha, Kashmir, Bengal. Then you have Visara school of architecture in Deccan, especially around the Hoysala around the Hoysala kingdom, and then you have Dravida school of architecture. So kings would also construct temples. Okay, now these temples will also need land grants. Why kings will construct temples? For legitimacy. You see, Chola kings used to put their own statues in their temples. Okay, they would go and worship into temples on specific occasions. So temple was a unique symbol of sovereignty of that king. It started out as an element of bhakti cult. Okay, bhakti was a simple religion. However, gradually it got associated as with the sovereign power, and it became the most manifest symbol of sovereign power. Just as during medieval period, whenever a Delhi Sultan or Mughal emperor, whenever they conquered a new area, they will construct a mosque there, and that mosque will be a symbol of sovereignty. Similarly, temple perform the same role. So even temples will be given land grants. Okay. Now, in these temples, often a local tribal deity who is now re-christianed as the avatar or incarnation of from a more larger deity like Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. So that tribal deity might be worshipped, or the regular gods will be worshipped there. So this is how we see the relationship between worship of new deities, temple construction, patronage to Brahmanas, and land grants can be viewed and associated with the quest for legitimacy by kings. Now we saw that bhakti emerged during ancient period as a simple religion. Okay, it focused on individual worship of gods, which could be in the form of statues. So therefore, temples began to be constructed, and we have earliest surviving temples from Gupta period, and gradually these temples became associated with the sovereignty of king as well. And then the arrival of Islam. Now often we associate the arrival of Islam with the Sindh conquest of Muhammad bin Qasim, but actually the earliest place in India where Islam arrived was in Kerala along with Arab merchants. Okay, and much later via Sindh. Along with Islam came the two main sects, Shia and Sunnis, and then Sufi Islam, which has influence on both Shias and Sunnis. So what are they? We will cover in later chapters. Okay, some of the kings or sultans were Shia, some of the kings and sultans were Sunnis, and these schools have their own jurisprudence. There are mainly four important jurisprudence in Sunnism, Sunni sect, and accordingly the political, economic, social and cultural laws, both civil and criminal laws of these states varied according to the jurisprudence of Sunni school. So they also had historical impacts. Now we talk about the periodization. Though history is not just a series of events, it's a stream of changes as well as continuities. Still, to study history you have to periodize. Okay, in ancient, medieval, modern, etc., that which period belongs to which period belongs to which era or how long, etc. Now the earliest attempt in modern India to periodize Indian history was made by this individual called James Mill. He was a utilitarian thinker. He wrote a book called History of British India, and he divided India's history into Hindu, Muslim and British. Three periods. He said Hindu because the country was Hindu. I don't know, maybe he thought that the religion of ruling class was Hindu, all of them were Hindu, maybe in his ignorance he thought. Then medieval was called Muslim. Second one was called Muslim because he thought the entire ruling class was Muslim. And then at third, instead of calling Christian, he says British. And so earlier religion was more important, but now the nationality is more important for some reason, I don't know. Then also he thought that in medieval period all the rulers were Muslim. But starting with the Sindh conquest of Muhammad bin Qasim in 1710 to the expansion of Delhi Sultanate and expansion of Mughal Empire is a very long period. Also during this period there were many independent sovereign kings who were not Muslim. Similarly in ancient period, can you call Ashoka Hindu? Okay, can you say anything certainly about the religion followed by different dynasties of post-modern period? Can you call the Rigvedic religion Hindu? So this was a very This periodization was based on a colonial mindset and had a rather mischievous intention to divide the Indian society along religious lines. Then came the new approach of looking at economic and social factors. So, early Marxist historians, on the basis of phenomena like feudalism, land grants, etc., divided Indian history into ancient. Even before them, after the British categorization of Hindu, Muslim, and British was cancelled, the nationalist historians divided it into ancient, medieval, and modern. This framework is actually based on European historiography. They also categorize their history into modern and ancient, and the long period of dark age between the fall of Roman civilization and the Enlightenment. That very long period is called medieval. So that framework was picked up and superimposed on Indian history without changing the exact timelines. For example, both James Mill said that the onset of the rather the beginning of Delhi Sultanate is the beginning of medieval Muslim period. So he did not change the timeline. Similarly, they also said, okay, the beginning of Delhi Sultanate is the beginning of medieval period. James Mill said that the beginning of British rule was the beginning of British period. So nationalist historians said that the beginning of British rule was beginning of modern period, as if the British rule brought modernity to India. So they though changed the name, but they did not change the features or the demarcation lines of this periodization. The demarcation lines were similar. Then a new group of historians came, Marxists and others. They looked at the larger economic and social factors to divide history into different periods. They saw that in the aftermath of Gupta Empire, the feudalization of Indian society started. There was a decline of urbanization, long distance trade, etc. Though that hypothesis is being challenged now. But they said that we can divide Indian society into ancient, medieval, and modern, not on the basis of the religion of ruling class, not on the basis of the European framework of dividing history, but on the basis of larger social and economic forces. They said ancient, medieval, and modern. But even in medieval, they picked up two periods. One was called early medieval, another was called medieval period. Why early medieval? Because during this phase a lot of ancient features continued, but from here there was a larger change. Though why this classification has been undertaken, I prefer not to go there, and that should be covered when you take history seriously for your optionals. Though we came to this point that okay, now we sorted out that periodization cannot be based on the religion of ruling class. Periodization can also not be based on the typical European framework of history. Periodization has to be based on economic and social factors, and even there you have to understand the nuances. However, this is still 1,000 years long period. Now some say 700, some say 750. Don't worry about the exact period, okay? This is still a 1,000 long period. So can you say that no changes took place during this period? I mean, all the changes were concentrated at this end and this end, and in this period the society was completely static? No, it was dynamic here also. In fact, what was happening during 8th century was, now think clearly, what was happening during 8th century was closer in reality to what was happening in 6th century. Similarly, what was happening in 18th century was closer to what was happening in 19th century. So this idea is, this periodization is only a convenience exercise, okay, so that you can study history conveniently. Beyond that, it has not much value, okay. Do not fuss over dates, etc. This periodization is only for academic convenience. Even during this long 1,000 years period, the society was very dynamic. Many changes were going on, and from the beginning to the end, the society had changed completely. Beginning in 1750, to 1750, sorry, beginning from 750 to 1750, the society had changed very drastically, and at 750 it was much closer to 650, and at 1750 it was much closer to 1850. Was the onset of modern period really a phase of material progress for India? Modern means most recent. See, when we said that the earlier nationalist historians took up the European tripartite classification of ancient, medieval, modern and put on top of Indian history, they did not realize one thing, that in the case of Europe, modern means progress, ideological progress, material progress, etc. But can we say that the onset of British rule, which is the demarcation line for the beginning of modern period for India, can we say that the beginning of modern period was beginning of modernity, was the beginning of progress? Certainly not. Why? Because we have to understand the social and economic factors, not just copycat some other framework. So in the case of India, modern history simply means recent history. Okay? That is, you have to remember. See, in the chapter 1, we have only talked about broad trends. We talked about how the nature of sources has changed. Okay, now literary sources predominate. However, we have to remember the context of literary sources. Okay, the meaning of words, the changes in technology, such things. Then we talked about new social groups, new religious ideas. Okay, the tension, the perpetual tension between regional dynasties and empires, and then we looked into the periodization of history. These are the broad trends that will be covered in detail in subsequent chapters. So this is the end of lecture 1. We will cover the rest of the chapters from next lectures. Thank you.